Hello, everyone. Welcome to our brand new podcast series on industry and market analysis, an initiative brought to you by MarketResearchReports.com. In this series, our hosts, Mike and Samantha, discuss key aspects of selected topics, providing valuable insights tailored for business professionals and decision makers. For those with limited time to navigate countless articles and videos, they'll do the legwork for you, delivering concise and actionable information. Let's get started.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really crucial element of our global systems, the agrochemical market.
Right.
Think fertilizers and pesticides, basically the backbone of modern agriculture, essential for feeding, well, everyone.
Mm-hmm. And what's striking, maybe a bit unsettling, as you say, is just how much volatility, how much change we've seen recently.
Exactly. It's a market where the stakes are incredibly high.
They really are. Decisions about, what gets produced, where, who buys it, it directly impacts global food security. And these recent shifts, well, they've been significant.
Absolutely, which is why we wanted to take a closer look.
Good idea.
So to bring everyone the most important insights, we've synthesized a comprehensive picture from a 4-part article series. This was published on MarketResearchReports.com.
Yeah, a really detailed series.
Yeah. So consider this your guided tour through the key dynamics shaping the industry right now.
Mm-hmm.
Our mission, if you will, is to pull out the crucial information.
So structure, trade.
Exactly. Structure, trade complexities, the disruptions from tariffs, and, the ongoing reshaping of the whole supply chain. It's kind of the essential briefing on this vital topic.
So what can people expect from this deep dive then?
Well, we'll start by identifying the major players, the countries, the companies leading the charge in production and trade.
Okay.
Then we'll analyze the big trends, who's importing, who's consuming.
And the impacts.
Yes. Finally, we'll break down the impact of things like trade wars, tariffs, and how all this is leading to a fundamental realignment, really, of how agrochemicals move around the globe.
Sounds good. A lot to cover.
It is. Okay, let's get right into it. Who are the dominant forces when it comes to producing and exporting these essential chemicals?
Okay, well, if we look at pesticides first, China is the clear leader. Really dominant. In 2023, they accounted for over 22% of all global exports. Their strength? Well, it's cost-effective manufacturing, a very integrated supply chain.
And that big merger.
Exactly. The ChemChina-Syngenta-Sinochem merger, creating Syngenta,
Right.
really cemented their global influence there. So what this means, for everyone listening, is that China's policies, the production capacity, it has a massive knock-on effect on pesticide availability and pricing worldwide.
22%. That's a huge share. Who else is a major player?
India holds the second spot. They've got about 18% of global pesticide exports. They're particularly strong in the generics market.
Off-patent stuff.
Precisely. Off-patent versions, often cheaper, which makes them really crucial for a lot of farmers globally. Beyond those two, you've got countries with, long-established chemical industries, the U.S., France, Germany, all making significant contributions too.
Okay. And shifting gears to fertilizers, who are the key players there?
It's a bit different for fertilizers. Russia leads the pack with around 16% of global exports,
Okay.
followed pretty closely by China at 12% and then Canada at 10%. These three are really the main suppliers of nitrogen, phosphate, potash fertilizers, the absolute fundamentals for crop growth.
So again, any shifts in their policies or production?
Oh yeah, it creates ripples right across global agriculture. Definitely.
It really sounds like a, relatively small number of countries have a pretty significant grip on the supply of both pesticides and fertilizers.
That's a fair assessment.
Now, let's drill down a bit. The companies themselves, who are the major corporate players?
Right. In crop protection, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, we often talk about the big four.
Okay, who are they?
Syngenta, which, as we said, is Chinese-owned now. Then Bayer Crop Science and BASF, both from Germany, and Corteva from the USA.
And they control.
Together, they command roughly 60% of the global market. It's huge. They offer everything from herbicides to insecticides, biologicals.
So their decisions, R&D, supply chains, it all has a massive impact.
A massive impact on what tools farmers actually get access to, absolutely.
60%. That's pretty concentrated. Are there other significant companies we should know about?
Oh, definitely. You have important sort of second-tier players. Think UPL from India, FMC from the US.
Okay.
Also Adama from China, Sumitomo Chemical from Japan. But what's really striking and maybe underlines the shift, is the rise of Chinese firms.
How so?
Well, by 2023-24, 12 of the top 20 global pesticide companies were Chinese.
12 out of 20.
Wow, yeah. It really underscores their growing dominance in this specific sector. It signals a pretty significant change in the global balance of power within the pesticide industry.
That is a notable evolution.
Yeah.
Okay, what about the fertilizer side? Who are the dominant companies there?
In fertilizers, Nutrien, based in Canada, is the leader, generally speaking, by revenue.
Okay.
Following them, you've got Mosaic from the USA and Yara from Norway. Other big names include CF Industries, also US-based, and the OCP Group from Morocco. These companies control really significant chunks of production and distribution for key fertilizer types.
So again, we're seeing this pattern, right? A few major corporations wielding considerable influence over global supply and, well, ultimately the price of these vital inputs.
Exactly right. And this leads to a really critical concept here: strategic interdependence.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, the decisions made by this relatively small group of nations and these dominant companies, whether it's about, expanding production, merging, even just putting on export restrictions, they can have substantial, far-reaching consequences for global food supply chains.
It's all connected.
Highly interconnected. An event in one part of the world can very quickly affect farmers and consumers elsewhere.
It really highlights how vulnerable the system can be, potentially. Okay, so we've identified the big producers, the big companies. Let's look at the trade side now. What have the main import and consumption trends looked like recently?
Let's start with fertilizers. We saw really significant swings in import costs between, say, 2021 and 2023.
Big swing.
Huge swings, especially for major agricultural nations like Brazil, India, the US. Globally, spending on imported fertilizers hit a peak, something like $153 billion in 2022. A massive jump.
Wow.
Then, as prices cooled off a bit, that figure dropped back to around $101 billion in 2023.
And those fluctuations directly
Impact farming costs and, ultimately, the food prices people pay.
What drove that volatility? It sounds pretty extreme.
The main drivers were sharp price hikes in 2022. A lot of that was down to supply chain chaos, geopolitical stuff.
The war in Ukraine?
That was a major factor, yes. Then there was a partial easing of those prices in 2023. Brazil, for example, their fertilizer import bill nearly doubled in 22, then dropped by 41% in 23.
Wow.
India and the US showed pretty similar patterns. It just highlights how reliant they are on those international fertilizer markets.
Okay. And what about pesticide use? Does that follow a similar up and down pattern?
Interestingly, no. Pesticide use has shown a much more consistent upward trend.
Really? Increasing?
Yeah. In 2022, global use of active pesticide ingredients hit 3.7 million tons. That was up 4% from 2021, and actually double what it was back in 1990.
Double since 1990.
Yeah. It reflects the ongoing, intensification of agriculture in many key regions.
Okay, so who are the biggest buyers and users of these agrochemicals globally?
Right. So for fertilizer imports in 2023, Brazil was top. Both by value, $14.6 billion, and by volume, they imported around 38 million tons back in 2022.
Yeah, Brazil #1.
Followed by India and the US as significant importers by value. China is interesting. It's the world's largest consumer of fertilizers, but it produces most of its own, so it doesn't show up as a top importer.
Oh, right. Self-sufficient mostly.
Largely, yes. France is another notable importer of fertilizer.
And pesticide imports. Who leads there?
Brazil again. Leads in pesticide imports by value. Their imports hit $7.1 billion in 2022, though that dropped to $4.9 billion in 2023.
Go. And others?
France, Canada, Germany, the US, also significant pesticide importers. But, and this is an important distinction,
Go on.
big agricultural countries like India and China, they are massive users of pesticides, but they're actually net exporters or mostly self-sufficient, so they aren't top importers.
Right. User versus importer. That's a key difference. Now, the articles also mentioned organic and biofertilizers, biopesticides. How big a piece of the pie are they?
Still pretty small, honestly, a relatively small segment. Organic fertilizers, for instance, were only about 1.1% of the total fertilizer trade value in 2023.
Just over 1%.
Yeah. Biopesticides have a slightly bigger share, maybe around 10% of the total pesticide market value in 2024. But There's definitely growing interest, growing investment.
Driven by sustainability concerns.
Exactly. Concerns about sustainability, environmental impact of conventional chemicals. It's a growing niche, but still niche.
Okay. Now, the reports had some really good country-specific examples of import dependence. Let's touch on a few. Brazil, you mentioned them as a top importer.
Yes, Brazil is a prime example, highly dependent on imports, especially for fertilizers. They bring in about 85% of their needs.
85%.
Yeah, which is seen as a significant strategic vulnerability for them. For the crucial stuff, nitrogen, phosphates, potash, it's even higher. Like 95% for nitrogen, 75% for phosphates, and 100% for potash.
100% for potash. Wow. That makes them incredibly susceptible, doesn't it?
Extremely susceptible to global supply shocks, price swings, you name it.
So what are they doing about it? Anything?
They are. Recognizing this, they launched a national fertilizer plan back in 2022. The goal is pretty ambitious: cut import dependence to 45% by 2050.
Oh.
It involves trying to boost domestic production, encouraging more use of organic options, improving efficiency. The price spikes in 2022 really hammered home the urgency for them.
I bet. Okay, let's look at India, another agricultural giant. What's their import situation?
India is a bit different. They have a more developed domestic industry, particularly for urea. That's a key nitrogen fertilizer.
Right.
But they're still heavily reliant on imports for phosphates, and especially potash. 100% of their potash is imported. Overall, maybe 25–30% of their total fertilizer needs are imported.
And their plans?
They've also set a goal for self-sufficiency in urea, aiming for 2025. They're building new plants, promoting this thing called nano-urea, and they're trying to diversify where they buy from to reduce risk. Plus, they have this massive fertilizer subsidy bill, which really highlights the economic weight of imports for them. It's part of their Atmanirbhar Bharat, or Self-Reliant India initiative.
Right. What about a developed economy like the U.S.? How dependent are they?
Well, the U.S. produces a lot of its own nitrogen and phosphate, so they're less dependent there. But potash is the key vulnerability. They import about 93% of their potash needs, mostly from Canada.
93% from Canada.
Primarily, yes. And to tackle concerns about price and competition, the U.S. government launched a fertilizer production expansion program, trying to boost domestic capacity.
Okay. And Europe. Maybe focus on France as a big EU agricultural player.
Right. France and the EU more broadly are net importers of both fertilizers and pesticides. The natural gas crisis in 21–22 hit their fertilizer production hard.
Because natural gas is a key feedstock.
Exactly. And ironically, it led to them importing more Russian fertilizer just when they were trying to cut dependence on Russian energy overall.
Strange outcome.
It was. Plus, you have the EU's Green Deal pushing to cut pesticide use, expand organic farming. That shapes their future needs, too. And things like the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, that could influence sourcing down the line.
These examples really show the different pressures and strategies worldwide, don't they?
Absolutely. Each country faces a unique set of challenges.
Okay, let's shift focus again. A major disruptor. Trade wars and tariffs. How have these messed with the flow of agrochemicals?
Oh, significantly. The U.S.-China trade war, starting back in 2018, that definitely hit pesticide trade.
How so?
The U.S. slapped 25% tariffs on, I think, 113 types of Chinese pesticide ingredients.
25%. Ouch.
Yeah. So it meant higher input costs for U.S. farmers, obviously, but it also forced a big restructuring of supply chains. India actually emerged as a major alternative supplier to the U.S. because of those tariffs.
So a bilateral dispute ripples outwards.
Exactly. Created opportunities for some, challenges for others.
What about tariffs specifically on fertilizers?
The U.S. did that too. In 2021, they put countervailing duties on phosphate fertilizers from Morocco and Russia.
How high were those?
Around 20% for Morocco and anywhere from 9% to 47% for different Russian producers. It caused imports from those countries to plunge.
And prices.
Pushed U.S. prices higher. Farmers felt that. Importers had to scramble for alternatives like Saudi Arabia. We actually saw the U.S. fertilizer price index hit a record high in March 2022. Those duties were a big part of that story.
Wow. A direct inflationary impact then.
Yeah.
Now, flipping it around, what about export restrictions? Do they play a role?
A huge role. China's decision to basically ban fertilizer exports starting late 2021, that had a massive global impact.
Which fertilizers?
Urea, DAP, MAP, nitrogen, and phosphate types. It created serious supply shortages globally, pushed prices way up. Countries like India, nations across Southeast Asia, they were forced to look elsewhere quickly. China's own export volumes dropped significantly because of those controls.
And then, of course, the Russia-Ukraine war and sanctions. We can't ignore that.
Absolutely not. The war itself, plus sanctions on Belarus, a major potash exporter, caused huge disruptions to fertilizer flows. Global prices spiked again. Bloomberg's Green Markets Index hit another record high.
But Russia still managed to export.
Yes, this is key. They managed to redirect a lot of their fertilizer exports to places like India, Turkey, Latin America. So while Western importers were looking for alternatives, like Canadian potash,
Russia found new buyers.
they did. And interestingly, Russia's overall fertilizer exports in 2023 actually ended up being higher than they were in 2021 before the full-scale invasion because of this trade diversion.
That's counterintuitive but fascinating. So the system adapted, but with major changes in trade routes.
Precisely. It led to clear sourcing shifts. We saw the U.S., the EU, India, Brazil, all adjusting where they bought from.
How specific?
Well, the U.S. bought more pesticides from India because of the China tariffs, shifted fertilizer imports towards Saudi Arabia, as we said. The EU, facing disruptions, imported more from North Africa, North America. India snapped up discounted Russian fertilizer and boosted its own pesticide exports. Brazil also diversified, leaned more on Russia for nitrogen.
It sounds like a much more fragmented or multipolar supply chain emerged.
That's a good way to put it. More multipolar, definitely. With increased involvement from the Middle East, South Asia, the whole map was being redrawn.
And the bottom line, the cost of all this turmoil on the ground.
Well, the most direct impact was soaring input costs for farmers everywhere. Just huge increases.
Can you give an example?
Sure, U.S. farmers spending on fertilizers alone hit a staggering $35.8 billion in 2023.
$35.8 billion. Wow.
Yeah. These higher costs squeezed profit margins, potentially led farmers to use less fertilizer or pesticides in some cases, and definitely contributed to the broader food price inflation that hit consumers globally.
It really brings it home how these global trade policies impact livelihoods and, well, the cost of groceries.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move to the final piece then. The global realignments we've seen more recently, say in the last year or so, what are the key trends from 2023-24?
Okay, so in fertilizer trade, Russia kept increasing exports to Asia despite sanctions. China, conversely, significantly cut its exports back.
Still enforcing those controls.
Seems like it, yes. Canada's potash share initially rose, but then dipped slightly as Russian volumes sort of recovered their footing in different markets. We also saw new nitrogen capacity coming online. Nigeria, Egypt, the U.S.,
And buyers.
India and Brazil notably increased their fertilizer imports from Russia. So that trend continued, that reshaping of trade flows.
Okay, the fertilizer picture is still shifting. What about pesticides more recently?
The overall global trade in pesticides actually contracted in 2023. That came after growth in 21 and 22. China's pesticide exports notably tumbled.
And India. They'd risen.
They had become number 2 exporter in 2022, but their volumes also dipped in 2023. They still held a strong position, though, and prices for both fertilizers and pesticides. They generally fell in 2023 from those 2022 peaks, but mostly stayed above pre-pandemic levels.
Right, not back to the old normal. And what about where stuff is being produced? Any shifts there?
Definitely seeing more diversification. Ammonia production in Europe, for example, has decreased, partly due to those high gas prices.
Right.
While production and exports from places like the U.S., the Middle East, North Africa, Asia have increased, India has been actively expanding its pesticide production, and the big multinational companies, they've all been adjusting their supply chains, trying to build resilience.
And government policies, tariffs still a big factor in 23-24.
Oh yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
China kept its fertilizer export controls on. Russia put an export duty on its fertilizers. The EU proposed those new tariffs on Russian and Belarusian fertilizers. U.S. phosphate tariffs are still influential. And India actually increased its fertilizer subsidies.
So governments are still actively trying to manage supply and cost.
Absolutely. Policy remains a huge driver in this market.
Okay, let's quickly touch on some regional highlights from this recent period. Europe.
Europe felt major supply disruptions in 22-23. They boosted imports from North Africa, the Middle East, North America. But also, that irony again, increased reliance on discounted Russian fertilizers late 22 into 23. Now, though, there's a big policy push for green ammonia, and those proposed tariffs signal a longer-term desire to cut dependence on Russia and Belarus.
Okay, North America.
Yeah.
The U.S. specifically.
Well, U.S. domestic fertilizer producers initially benefited from the high prices, but farmers paid the price, literally. The U.S. also exported more fertilizer to Europe. On pesticides, U.S. imports shifted more towards India away from China due to those tariffs. And strategically, there's a big push to boost North American production blue ammonia in the U.S., potash expansion in Canada.
And India's experience recently.
India played it strategically, didn't they?
Hmm.
Secured discounted Russian fertilizer, made real strides towards that urea self-sufficiency goal with new plants coming online, and really cemented their role as a major pesticide exporter.
What about Southeast Asia? They were hit hard by China's bans initially.
They were. Prices skyrocketed. One response has been Chinese companies actually investing in local production within Southeast Asia. Indonesia announced major plans to expand its own fertilizer production. And there's been a shift towards using more pesticides formulated in India or locally.
And down under, Australia and New Zealand, highly import reliant.
Yeah, they face severe price shocks, real supply scares. There's been a dramatic shift away from Chinese phosphate imports. Australia is seriously exploring domestic production now, especially green ammonia. And both countries have started holding larger stockpiles, just in case.
Finally, Latin America, Brazil.
Brazil continued diversifying its fertilizer sources, increased reliance on Russia for nitrogen. They also bought more pesticides from India. And there's renewed talk about developing their own potash resources to finally tackle that huge import dependence.
Wow. It is crystal clear that the entire global agrochemical supply chain has just undergone this profound transformation really fast.
In a remarkably short period, yes.
Okay, let's try and summarize the key takeaways from all this analysis based on those marketresearchreports.com articles.
I think the main themes are, first, the concentration in the market. A few players have a lot of power. Second, the sheer volatility and interconnectedness of global trade. Third, the huge impact of geopolitics and trade policies. And fourth, this growing focus now on supply chain resilience, on diversification, trying to mitigate future shocks. For anyone listening, understanding these dynamics is just crucial for anticipating what might happen next with input costs and ultimately food security.
And just to quickly recap the key player shifts.
Sure. China's dominance in pesticides remains key, though its role in fertilizer exports has changed because of its own policies. Russia, despite everything, is still a massive force in fertilizers, just selling to different places. And India's influence has grown significantly, both as a strategic buyer and a rising pesticide exporter.
Right. So considering all these dramatic shifts, the sustainability push,
Yeah.
What's the critical question listeners should be mulling over?
I think the fundamental question is, what's the next big disruption? Or maybe the next big innovation that reshapes this landscape? Is it more geopolitical turmoil? Is it a breakthrough in sustainable farming that dramatically cuts demand for synthetics?
Yeah.
Or something totally unexpected?
And crucial.
And crucially, how can businesses, how can policymakers best prepare for whatever comes next? How do we ensure a stable, secure food supply through all this change?
Those are absolutely vital questions. And if you, our listener, want to dive even deeper, get into the real granular data behind these trends.
Then you should definitely check out the source material.
Exactly. We strongly recommend exploring the full 4-part article series on marketresearchreports.com. It's packed with detailed information.
Absolutely. This deep dive gives you the overview, the key findings, but the articles themselves offer that much deeper perspective. Essential reading if you need to stay ahead of the curve in this, well, rapidly evolving industry.
That's right. So be sure to visit marketresearchreports.com. Explore the detailed reports. Keep yourself informed on this critical global market. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.